Hi, I'm Andy Johnson, and this is 3 Seconds Ahead, where we get to meet and learn from ordinary people with extraordinary stories. My guest today is Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, who describes himself as a clinical psychologist, criminologist, advocate of the High Court, with an interest in forensic and investigative psychology. I've added that he's a dad, a friend, and he has also recently launched a podcast, and it's called Alpha. Can you just remind me, Gerard?
Zulu Alpha. Zulu
Alpha
Firearms
yeah.
Channel.
And it's dealing with firearms in South Africa, ownership, and the trials and tribulations associated with that, because I'm a gun owner. He, as the head of the investigative psychology section of SAPS, the South African Police Services equivalent of the behavioral analyst units of the FBI, he testified in more than 100 cases and investigated more than 300 serial murders and rapes. After 14 years in the service of South Africa and its citizens, and I am certainly grateful, thank you, Gerard, he resigned his post at SAPS as a brigadier, man, very impressive, and now as the director of LNS Threat Management, South Africa's first sole purpose threat assessment and management company focusing on workplace violence. Gerard, welcome to 3 Seconds Ahead. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
And I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Gerard, listen, I mean, we were at school together many years ago, and we reconnected at our reunion after 30 years. We kind of went our separate ways, and I must say it was a pleasure to see you again. And I'm hoping to see more of you in the future. But for those people that don't know you, I tend to ask one question at the beginning of all my interviews, and it goes something like this. Gerard, where does your story begin?
Sure, that's an interesting one. I suppose you could say that, I mean, we're obviously influenced by everything that happens to us, you know, from our parents and what happened to them and how they were raised, etc. I suppose I would say that for me, a lot of what I would say contributed to where I am now was, I think in part the fact that when I was very young, I lived in different places, born in Vienna because of my father's work, then South Africa, then the States, then South Africa, then the States. And I kind of do think that had a profound impact on me, perhaps just, and I suppose an outlook on life in a way. It's probably one of the things that I would say really, I think, stood out for me in terms of my sort of earlier formative years. Good and bad, obviously influences of that type of stuff. But yeah, I think that's definitely, whether it's a start, it's definitely one of an impactful kind of thing that I went through at that age, those ages,
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, your dad was in the diplomatic service, and I mean, you arrived at the boarding house, I think, it wasn't you went there from Form 1, were you? I can't remember now.
Yep.
Yeah, but yes, I do. Yeah, you do. But you were this chap from America, but you were South African. It was a bit kind of confusing for everybody. So I can imagine it was even more confusing for you. So as a result of that diplomatic service, you were kind of all over the place, and you were having to settle down and reconnect in new places all the time. That sort of reconnection and having to begin again fairly frequently, how did that impact the way that you saw the world?
Look, I think obviously, your friendship ties, when you're little, out of sight, out of mind. I did keep one or two good friends in those years, for example, that I was in overseas before coming back to high school, because my parents remained on in the States. So as you know, I came back to join boarding school, Standard 6, American accent, braces, glasses, nerdy looking, not achieving the marks of a nerdy, unfortunately. So I left behind all those friends in the States. I kind of knew one or two people that were joining at Pretoria Boys High where we were. So I think that chopping and changing of friendships, I think has an impact on you, as any diplomat's child would. And, literally being dropped in it, my parents dropped me off at boarding school, went back to the States, and I would see them, 3 times a year. So that was very difficult. I mean, it was always an adjustment coming back. It definitely, I think, made me stronger. Did it have a negative impact? Probably to some degree. Maybe there's other people will be able to say how badly it impacted me or not. But I do think, like I said, overall, given that different perspective on the world and life, difficult to quantify exactly how, but I think it definitely had a positive impact. But as I said, the negative side of it too.
Yeah, it sounds to me that it's sort of you learn to be sort of quite resilient early on in your life to deal with sort of tough situations forced upon you. You sort of thought, well, I've got to get on with it. Well, that's what it sounds like to me. I don't know if that resonates with you or not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Cool. So when we finished school, we went our separate ways, and I did some research, and you went off to the University of Pretoria, and you started studying psychology. I saw you recently posted a picture of yourself where you looked a bit like a hippie. I must say I was very impressed with that long hair that you had. So you went off to university and studied psychology. Why psychology?
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, I first went to the army.
Oh,
So I did
yes.
back then it was the year of national service. And I mean, my matric results were horrific. I mean,
Yeah.
I had E's, some on standard grade. I think my highest mark was a C that I got. And at the end of school, I had no idea what I wanted to study. And I don't really think Pretoria boys are prepared. For those of us who are a bit clueless, really helped us get an idea of where we wanted to go. I think sort of guidance counseling was very limited to people who knew what they wanted to do and helping them get there. Or that was at least my experience of it. So really, I went in not knowing what I wanted to do. And in a way, lucky I didn't go randomly study something, because it would have been probably a disaster. And I think by the end of that year in national service, I was really keen to get my life going. And, you know, my mother had suggested psychology. And in those days, I didn't even know the difference between psychiatry and psychology. And I kind of looked at her and I said, you do understand I would never get into medicine, my results. And she's, no. Psychology is a bit different. It's a different sort of pathway, etc. And then I kind of, in a way, it made sense. And I suppose that's parents often do know their children quite well, I guess. And I looked into it, and I actually applied for public relations at the Technikon and psychology at Tuckey's. And I got into both. And thank goodness I didn't go into public relations, because I think I would have been terrible at it. And I just really found myself literally from day one being fascinated by what I'm studying. And I think, you know, the first Friday at the end of the first week or two of university, on a Friday night, I was sitting at my desk reading my books. My mother walked in, saw this. I didn't think she knew what to make of it. It's a Friday night, and here's Gerard reading through his textbooks, and she quietly just sort of backed out the room. And it was, I think, purely because I was really fascinated by what I was reading and what I was being exposed to. It was all in Afrikaans, and I mean, we weren't, our Afrikaans at, I think in English schools, the emphasis on Afrikaans was more survival Afrikaans as opposed to getting by with it. And I really sat there, and I had to translate every, you know, my study guides I had to translate, and I would sit in class, and the first 5 minutes I'd understand, then I'd be lost. And so quickly, a big learning curve in the first sort of few months of being at Tuckey's. But really was just fascinated by what I was doing, and that kind of reflected in my performance. I started to do well. I started to get marks that at high school I thought were way beyond my capabilities. And I always felt I was smart, but I didn't experience it. And I thought, well, okay, I'm not dumb, but I'm not achieving at school. I wasn't achieving you know, how I thought I could. And I really did start to question it. And it was really at varsity when it just, you know, I suppose it's the pairing up of what you are geared to do in your mind and the way your mind works, meeting that, whether it's a career or a study pathway or whatever it is, doesn't really matter. But that merging of two things and suddenly you just feel yourself sort of taking off in the right direction.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, you're talking about how your parents or your mother in this particular case kind of, in some deep way, there was a trust that you had. And you remembered that she said this, you know, maybe I should trust her this time. And you did, which is, I think it's a great lesson for all children, particularly teenagers. But I want to circle back just a little bit to national service. I didn't do national service when we finished. For me, I don't know if I regret it or not. I think it probably would have been good for me. So from that sense, I regret not going, because it's kind of, I feel like it was a rite of passage that I missed out of, sort of a hardship that I needed to go through, but I didn't get, and I chose not to do that. You said at the end of your national service, you wanted to get on with your life. What happened? How did you get there?
Well, you know, look, I was a medic firstly, and I worked at the military hospital, so I wasn't doing anything, you know, dangerous per se that a lot of other people were exposed to. So, you know, for me, it was really, I enjoyed what I did. I found it interesting. I worked in the intensive care unit, but I just felt at the end of it, like I really, really want to do something that's for me meaningful. Yes, you can say helping patients, but I mean, I knew that wasn't what I was destined to do, you know, as a career. I just felt I really, really wanted, I definitely wouldn't say I wasted that year, but I want to get on with what I want and need to do.
Yeah.
And I think if I'd probably even gone to study psychology straight after school, I probably wouldn't have been as motivated and done as well if I hadn't had that year of almost in a way being put on hold in certain ways. And I think that for me it worked, and I think for other people it didn't work. I mean, you can't say there's no generic answer to whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, or to take a gap year as a good thing or a bad thing. It really depends, I think, on the individual, the maturity. I don't think I was very mature when I finished matric. I think I was far more mature after that year, and that's probably what I needed. In different ways, difficult to sort of pinpoint it and quantify, but it worked for me. It might not have worked for a lot of other people. Yeah, it's also the reason why I grew my hair so long afterwards, because I wanted to do everything opposite to the military, and that was to grow my hair long.
No, you went from one extreme to the other. But it sounds to me that in that you had an opportunity to reflect on yourself. You also found yourself, forced or not, in a position where you were of service to others. Being a medic, being in that environment where you could help other people, and perhaps that sort of sparked something inside you. You thought, geez, this is a field that I really get a lot of satisfaction out of. I've grown up, and then HR, or it was public relations, and then into psychology. And psychology really is a fantastic field where you can be of service to others in a very positive way. So it's sort of that opportunity to reflect. Just to share with you, I was talking to my son today. As I said, he's in matric, and I was asking about the COVID lockdown. And he said to me, he said, Dad, it sounds strange, but actually it's been really good for me. I've had an opportunity to think about my life. I've had some space to consider. I haven't been overwhelmed by school and matric and all the other things that have come around me. There's been this gap, and he's made some big decisions. Like he was going to go overseas, but he's chosen not to do that because he wants to do something else. And for me, it's been quite profound because he's had the space to reflect on himself. And that national service, it sounded like it gave you that opportunity as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. Now that you mention it, it makes a lot of sense that this is really a year that for most people has just been something you could never have imagined, firstly, totally having to alter the way of our lives, to reassess what we do, to not be able to do the things that we normally enjoy. And in a way, I suppose for many people, this is like a national service year. It's made you reassess a whole bunch of stuff and what's important and where do you want to go. And many people, like you say, lives are on hold to a large degree. And maybe that's, in a sense, is a good way to reframe it as a good thing for many of us.
Yeah.
You can come out of it worse off, absolutely. But I mean, I've looked at it this way. I've thoroughly enjoyed the extra hour. I calculated the other day, I'm getting like 30 hours extra with my son that I wouldn't have had per week.
Yeah.
And that's
that's a blessing.
Where would you have gotten that back? I've learned, as you say, how to make ciabatta bread, which I'd never known how to do. I've started, I've started writing my book that people have always nagged me to write. It's had its hardships. I mean, 2 months, for the first 2 months, no money coming in. Now that's slowly changing, and we'll see how it goes, with the next few months. So again, it's like anything, how you reevaluate and realign it as, is it something bad, or what can I get out of it that's at least positive? Otherwise, you've wasted those months if you don't get anything out of it, whether it's a lesson you've learned or a new career, or, like I said, started a YouTube channel, which is fun. Maybe it'll make some money. Who knows if it does or doesn't. But I enjoy it. I feel rewarded by it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm in the same boat. I mean, what you've just shared with me is exactly the same position that we've been in. And it's taken an 18-year-old in the car drive back from school to say, geez, I've used this as an opportunity to reflect. I thought, wow, he's smarter than I'm giving him credit for. So that's been really great. So Gerard, Tux University, I was at Rhodes University, lots of fun, getting on with it, doing your studies. And then how did you end up at the South African Police Service?
Yeah, because look, I went into psychology thinking I'm going to open up a private practice, maybe work at the university, be a lecturer, etc. I mean, like everybody, I think you have an interest in the crime side of it. I mean, that's why all these crime programs on DSTV are so popular, because it fascinates people. But I didn't think that's going to be my career pathway. But maybe, again, the universe knew something more than I did. Eventually fortunate enough to get into the master's course, which is quite difficult. They only take 8 people a year for the different various categories. Got in the first time. And a colleague of mine was actually from the police, and they'd obviously sponsored him to go and do his 2-year master's training. And he said, look, why don't we do it on serial murder? It's an interesting topic, and he knows people because he's in the police, and we could probably get permission to get access to files. And I said, well, you got to do a dissertation. What the hell? Let's do it on something interesting. And again, interested in crime. And we did that, but still, when I finished that, it wasn't with a thought, this is now my career path. And I went, after I did my internship at the military hospital, went to work at Vestfold now as a qualified psychologist for about 3.5 years. Again, did my doctorate, thinking, well, what's the easiest way to get a doctorate? Well, continue with your master's. It's the shortest route. So again, the topic was, revisiting serial murder. But I'd always knew that I heard about this particular position in this particular unit in the police. And I'd always said, well, you know what, if it comes available, I'll apply and I'll maybe do it for 2 years if I get it and move on. And of course, the position did come available. It was advertised. I applied and I got it. And I almost had this quandary about should I take it or not, because I was actually quite happy at Vestfold Hospital.
Yeah.
I enjoyed what I was doing. I was working with students. I was working with interesting, psychopathology issues. We did a little bit of forensic assessments. You had quite a free reign of, what you could do. I started a family therapy clinic, which I found that fascinating, working with families. So I wasn't unhappy, and I almost said, maybe I shouldn't take it, because why leave something you're happy in for something you have no idea whether you're going to enjoy it? And I said, no, I'm going to do it. And I knew, I think within the first week or two, that I'd found a place where I was going to be for a very, very long time.
Yeah, it's really one of those scenarios of be careful what you wish for, because you just may get it. So just for those people that are listening who don't know what Vestfold is, just give a little lowdown on what that is.
So it's, and I think it still is the largest government psychiatric hospital, inpatient psychiatric hospital in the country, if I'm not mistaken. When I went there, it had 1,200 beds, and I think they reduced it to about 1,000 beds. And it has the only inpatient children's ward and the only inpatient adolescents ward. And it has also a forensic assessments portion. So in other words, let's say you're arrested for a crime and they think there might be a mental health issue. They then send you for what they call observation for 30 days. And then at the end of it, a report will be given to the court saying, yes, you're fit to stand trial and you were responsible at the time of the incident or not. So it had quite a wide variety of different things, but basically it's a government hospital. So literally anybody who doesn't have medical aid and needs to go there, or, most private hospitals don't take involuntary patients. In other words, people who are sent there against their will, even for a short time period. So even if you're a very wealthy person, you could very well end up in Vestfold if you needed to be committed for a certain period of time. And usually it's not a very long period of time. And basically I was the psychologist on one of the multidisciplinary teams.
Okay, that's pretty clear. And, I've got a question down here, and I think it overlaps from Vestfold into your experience in the police service. And I wrote down, I said, you've witnessed and investigated what can only be described as a result of the darkest nature of humanity. Serial murder, rape, violent crime, dealing with people that need to be observed for under observation for legal reasons, people being committed against their will. These are pretty difficult things for most people to face, not because they aren't real. It's because, generally speaking, they're kind of hidden away from the general public, because it's kind of, it doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen to me. So I think what the question that I'm really fascinated by is, and this is quite broad, and I'm sure we're going to have another conversation in the future, but what did you learn about yourself in dealing with different types of patients or people at Vestfold, and in particular when you've had to deal with the darkest side of human behavior and nature?
Sure. What I learned about myself. I think the one thing I realized when I left the police after the 14.5 years is that the impact upon you, you're often very blind to it. If I looked at the 6 months after I left, I basically spent, whether you want to use the word decompressing, And it's only really then that I realized what level of stress I was operating at. So I suppose the one thing I learned as well, I can actually deal with, the human being can deal with a fair amount of stress for a long period of time. But when I left, I realized how far I was coming down from that stress. And I think what happens is you learn, you just believe that the level of stress you have is the norm. And if you had to ask me in those times, how are you feeling? Are you stressed out? I'd go, no, I'm not. I would only feel stressed when something on top of that high level irritated me. And then I said, okay, now I'm feeling irritated because this person did something that pissed me off, to put it very politely. And then you come back to that high level, base level. And it was 6 months that I realized, actually, wow, that unhealthy level of stress that I've been operating on, that you get short-tempered, you snap at the littlest the littlest things irritate the hell out of you. And I just sometimes go into a bad mood for no apparent reason that I wouldn't understand why. For literally 1 minute I'd be okay, nothing would happen, and the next minute I'd be irritated for 2 days. So that was the impact. What did I learn? Well, I think definitely what I got out of it is that if you're not doing something that satisfies your soul, it's difficult to do. I don't think I would have been able to deal with that level of stress if I didn't actually love what I was doing. And I think that comes, if I reflect back, I mean, most of my life I've been a civil servant, 3.5 years at Vestfold, and then 14.5 in the police. And I found it incredibly rewarding to be doing something for people that, I was giving input at the hospital that people would pay in private practice to their private practitioners, a couple $100 an hour, to people who were paying nothing. You're helping the poorest of the poor in the police who were the victims of crime, and you're giving them sort of I felt from our side at least, a service that, is comparable to overseas people who do that, who are doing that kind of work. So I think if you don't have that inner reward, I don't know how you'd last. And that's what made me ultimately leave, is that I felt I wasn't getting that inner reward anymore. And I said to myself, you can spend 17 years in this job because it's the government. It's very difficult to get fired. Being unhappy for the next and hating every day, where I used to get to work early because I loved it. And I could get through those 17 years miserably and then spend the remaining years of my life complaining about the last 17 years and bitching about the police and this and that. And that's not worth it. And I suppose you could say it's never been about money for me, because all my colleagues who studied most of them went into private practice and earned fairly good salaries. And, I was working for government, earning not even a quarter of what those guys and the other people that were studying with me were earning. And it was purely because I really felt that inner reward at what I was doing. And when I stopped feeling the inner reward, it was time to go.
It's fascinating that you say that, because I said in the beginning, certainly for me, and it's something in my later life that I've also learned is that really, if you put service in the front of being of service to others, that really is being of service to yourself. And what I heard you say with your experience with the police is that like week one, you loved it. And it was the service that you were giving. You were helping people. Doesn't matter who they were, rich, poor, male, female, different races, different colors, creeds. It didn't matter, but you really felt like we were giving an amazing service. You were part of a team that wanted to be great and wanted to give the best possible service, and you did. And then after 14 years, it came to an end, which can be quite traumatic. When you realize, geez, I don't love what I used to love anymore. Okay. And what I liked about what you were saying is that you were honest enough with yourself to say, you know what, this has come to an end and it's time for me to move on. Because I don't want the next 17 years of my life to define the rest of my life. I want to get bigger and better and do more interesting things, which takes a hell of a lot of courage, particularly when you're at the highest level. I mean, you were a brigadier in the police. I mean, you could have stayed there as long as you wanted to. I mean, you're professional. So it takes a lot of courage to change. And you spoke about your what sounded like almost post-traumatic stress after 14 years in the police, and in 6 months to decompress. which is interesting is that humans have this uncanny ability to acclimatize to anything. It can be to the cold or the heat, the stress, the not stress. And circling back to what we said earlier about COVID lockdown, we've all had 3 months. And in the 3 months that we've had, yes, there's been stress, but it's nothing near to the stress that we've all had before the 3 months. I mean, as you said, you've got 36 extra hours with your son that you didn't have. And I think we can be pretty honest that most people are having that experience. So, I mean, from my side, I actually have to congratulate you for having the courage to do that, because not many people can say, it's time for me to move on and start something new. So that brings me to my next question. We've touched on it, but I mean, 14 years out of, as a high-ranking member of the police, you've had to begin again. And I choose that phrase very carefully, or we're running out of time, because this COVID lockdown for me, and the reason why I do this has highlighted one thing, is that some way or another, we all have to begin again. There's been actually a lot of new beginnings in your life. Just if I could ask you to reflect on those experiences, is anything that pops out for you that you've always fallen back on to help you to begin again? Sort of the basics, the fundamentals that you've always take with you whenever you start something new. Is anything that comes to mind?
You know, I think I mean, literally when I left the police, it was literally starting from scratch, you know, because I wasn't in a position to get a business going on the side, nurture it, and then leave when that kind of got hooks into it because of the nature of the work of the police, that you're not allowed to sort of double dip, if you want to call it that.
Yes,
So I literally walked out there and had to start going to speak to people, etc. I think if you don't have the faith that it would work, and sometimes you have to have blind faith. Sometimes you have to tell yourself it'll work, even if it looks like it probably won't.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do that, it definitely won't.
Yeah.
And just had a feeling that it will work. Perhaps also a little bit of it has to work because I knew I couldn't stay where I was anymore. I could not see myself another week at that particular, staying in the police. And I think it was just a blind faith that, in a way, you can call it a sense of karma. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I kind of can't help but, if I look back on my life, think that there's something out there that, in a way, was watching over me. And whether that's my inner confidence or it became an inner confidence, I don't really know. That it would work. It will be okay. You're going to have to put the effort into it, and it's not going to be easy, but it will work.
So it sounds
where
like
that comes from, I can't really put a finger on it.
In the end, I mean, it sounds to me what you're saying is that you have a self-belief and you trust it in yourself.
Yep.
So whenever you've had to begin again, even if you may not have noticed it, but every time, whenever you've started something new, you've kind of said to yourself, I trust me. I trust that I'll get through to the end, whatever the end looks like. I just know that I'll get there. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great stuff. So, you know, I've got a limited time. I like to keep my interviews short. But that being said, I'm definitely going to be having another chat with you because I want to explore your podcast and many other areas in your life. But in the last couple of minutes, I always like to ask my guests, for those people that are listening, particularly during the COVID times, but generally in life, what message would you like to give people out there from you based on your experience to say, during these interesting times, just focus on these things or do this or do that? Do you have anything that you'd like to share from your perspective and what you've learned?
Yeah, I think it's like I said, you know, if you, you'll always have difficult times, no matter if it's COVID or health issues, etc. If you can always just have that little bit of what can I learn from this, or what can I benefit from this, and how can I gain from this, or my family, or me, or etc. That I think if you don't have that, you will always have almost like a negative slant on things, if that's one way I can put it. I think that's in a way perhaps the key. If you can always try. I mean, if you look at Viktor Frankl, who was in a bloody concentration camp, and barely survived.
Mm.
But he came out with it with a whole theory of how you find meaning in life. And I think that's always been one of the most important things to me. How can I create meaning in this situation, this horrible thing I'm going through for a couple hours maybe, or over a longer period of time? How do I get meaning out of that? It makes it easier, an easier pill to swallow. You come out a little bit better, maybe a lot better at the end of it, which is going to set you up for a better success when this is over. Yeah, and I think if you can't find meaning, I think that's a very sad. And it's different. I'm not saying that's easy, but something out of it that's positive.
Yeah,
that gives you that little bit of hope.
Yeah, it sounds to me, and it's something I've been toying with as well. What you're saying is that, in actual fact, the meaning lies within the process. We get so hung up on the outcome, the ending, that we forget that we've got to go through a process to get there, and the difficulty, the hardship, the suffering that you're going through in the process actually is the meaning. So I'm going to thank you for your time. I know it's precious to you. I really appreciate your honesty and you trusting me with your story. And I look forward to exploring them further if you're open to it. And I'm sure we'll chat about that. But thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Thanks for listening to the end. You must have enjoyed it. Please like and share. And a subscription would be appreciated. It helps me grow the podcast. Something I love doing. It's really encouraging getting your support. Thank you. The views and opinions expressed by this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of 3 Seconds Ahead. Any content provided by authors are of their opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. While authors strive for accuracy, we can and will be wrong at times, as any honest person will have to admit.